Have you found a pattern that you love, but it's all in Japanese? In today's video, I'll be teaching you how to read and interpret Japanese knitting patterns. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Cletus, and I aim to bring you guys fun, informative, and entertaining videos all about knitting. If you find value in this video, please consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell. It really helps me a lot. So a few days ago, over on my Instagram, I posted a photo of a beautiful sweater design from a Japanese knitting pattern book called Richmore. Now, a bunch of you guys loved it too and asked me where to find it, but it's all in Japanese. So today, I'll be teaching you guys how to read and interpret Japanese knitting patterns so you can unlock a whole new world of knitting. Before we get started, I am from Hong Kong, not Japan. Believe me, I've had a few people confuse that before. For today's video, I'll be using a free basic men's knitting sweater pattern that I found over gozyo.co.jp, and I will be talking through how I, as a non-Japanese speaker, figure out this pattern. So let's open up the pattern and take a look. So here at first glance, you can already see how simplistic and easy a Japanese pattern is. The entire sweater fits on one page. You can also see the biggest difference between Japanese knitting patterns and Western patterns, that Japanese patterns do not write out step by step, row by row. The Japanese patterns use these cute little diagrams and knitting charts, which means you don't actually have to speak Japanese in order to knit it. So first, let's scroll up to the top of the pattern. Here you'll find a picture of the finished product and some essential information you need before you get started. The first line here talks about the yarn they use, and you can kind of guess that with the indication of G, meaning grams. You can also tell they're talking about yarn because of this Japanese character, which is a measure word for balls of yarn. In the description down below, I have popped a short little translation of essential Japanese knitting terminology that you can always come back and refer to. So for this pattern, you need a total of 360 grams of yarn, and at 40 grams per ball, you will need 9 balls in total. Now, unfortunately, most Japanese patterns do not include the yardage. So now you may be thinking, how can I possibly substitute my yarn? Don't worry, I'll touch on this again in just a moment. The next line talks about needle sizes. Now, this Japanese character here indicates needle size. So if you see a number followed by this character, you know they're talking about needle size. Now, Japan has its very own needle sizing system. So I'll pop up on screen right now a conversion chart that you can always come back to and figure out what needles you need. This line here also tells you what kind of needles you need. These two phrases tell you in Japanese what you need, but I don't bother memorizing them. I can see the number 2 on this phrase, meaning that we will just need 2 regular knitting needles in size 6 and size 8. And in this phrase with the number 4, I can accurately deduce that we need 4 double-pointed needles in size 5 and 6. This is where experience comes into play a little bit, because I can also guess we need DPNs because of the pickup stitches around the neck. The next line is about the measurements. Now, one big drawback about Japanese knitting patterns is they don't often come in a huge variety of sizes. For this example, it only comes in the 1 size. So you can either use Google Translate or open up the description to see the translation of the measurements. And the last line here is all about gauge. Here you'll find 2 very important Japanese symbols that is used a lot, and you should try and memorize them. The first one is this symbol, which means stitches, and this symbol meaning rows. For this gauge, you will need to knit 18 stitches by 25 rows to obtain a 10 by 10 centimeter gauge. Back to yarn substitution, I can think of 2 main ways you can figure this out. The first way is to reverse Google search the very first line to figure out the exact product they use. That way you can find how many yards is in 360 grams of that specific yarn. Alternatively, you can try and find yarn that is as close to or fits completely the gauge the pattern mentioned. On the packaging of most balls of yarn, they do have a little diagram telling you what the gauge is for that yarn. Now, let's jump into the diagrams. This phrase up here indicates that this diagram is for the back piece. Again, I have a translation guide in the description. Now, don't get overwhelmed by all these numbers and Japanese characters. I promise it is very simple. So if you look at the bottom of this piece, we can see the arrow down here. This indicates that the piece is knitted from the bottom up. On the bottom here, we can see the number 98, followed by this symbol again. Do you remember what it means? It means stitches. And over here we can see the character for needle size again, and it's showing us 6. So now I know I need to cast on 98 stitches on a Japanese size 6 needle. But Cletus, how do you know what method cast on to use? Well, that's another thing about Japanese knitting patterns. They usually allow for a lot of room for interpretation, customization, and for your creative freedom. So this phrase here in Japanese means 2x2 ribbing. Now, I'm not gonna remember it, and I don't expect any of you guys to learn Japanese to remember it either. So from looking at the photo, seeing the number 2, I can pretty much deduce that it's a 2x2 ribbing. But the pattern also gives you another way to figure this out. At the bottom here, you can see some horizontal and vertical lines. In Japanese knitting patterns, the vertical lines indicate a knit stitch, and the horizontal lines indicate a purl stitch. So if we're reading the pattern from right to left as we're facing the right side of the pattern, we can see that we start with knit 3 and then purl 2, knit 2, repeat to the end, ending on a knit 1 stitch. Over on the right side of this diagram, we can see that they want you to do this for 6 centimeters, or 14 rows in total. Now let's talk about the body of the sweater. So we can already see this reoccurring symbol again, meaning needle sizes. So the pattern wants you to switch to a size 8 needle. Again, you don't need to memorize what this phrase in the middle here means, but you can see that it is exactly the same as labeled on the knitting chart. With the aid of the photo, you know that you will be knitting the chart pattern on the body. Even if a pattern is extremely complicated, they'll usually list them as A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, and you just have to match up the chart with what is stated in the diagram. Here we can see that we're supposed to work the chart for 36 centimeters or 90 rows. I won't go into detail on Japanese chart reading right now because that is a whole other video. If you're curious about that, leave a comment down below, subscribe, and let me know. Once you reach this part of the pattern, you can see in the diagram that there is a sharp horizontal line going inwards. Since it's not a slope or a slant, you can obviously deduce that it is binding off. These characters are the Japanese characters for binding off, if you choose to memorize them. And in this pattern, it asks you to bind off 6 stitches on either side, leaving a 3 centimeter decrease. Now we have arrived at the neck and shoulder shaping. Now don't freak out, I know neck and shoulder shaping is quite difficult and intimidating, especially to beginner knitters, but trust me, it is very simple. From the diagram, we can deduce that we are binding off the middle section for our neck. We can also see the Japanese symbol for binding off. Here they want us to bind off 22 stitches in the middle. Again, Japanese patterns do not hold your hand, so you will have to do a little bit of math to figure that out. We started originally with 98 stitches, and we took off 6 stitches over here on either side. That leaves us with 86 stitches. Then, once you remove 22 stitches for the neck, you will be left with 64 stitches. Now you divide 64 by 2, giving 32. So, now we know that we are knitting 32 stitches into the middle before binding off 22 and then knitting to the rest of the row with another 32 stitches. Now, like most bottom-up sweaters, we are going to work each individual shoulder separately. Over here on the diagram, you can see a slight curve which indicates decreases. In Japan, the shaping pattern is indicated by this small little block of text that you read from the bottom up, consisting of numbers and Japanese characters. Now don't freak out, once you know how to use it, it's very easy. So the first line at the bottom here is 114. What does this mean? The first number represents rows, the middle number, stitches, and the last number, the number of times you do this. So for this pattern, for every one row, we decrease 1 stitch, and we do this pattern 4 times. Confused? Are you still with me? Okay, let's look at another example on this pattern. So if you scroll down here, we'll see the diagram for the sleeve. And from the diagram, you can see the piece is slowly growing outwards, which means you're increasing. And when we're reading it bottom up, the first row is 6, 1, and 11. So in this example, every 6 rows, you increase 1 stitch, and you do this for a total of 11 times. Now back to the back piece of the sweater. After we finish this decreasing pattern 4 times, we look up again and we can see the number 2 followed by some Japanese symbols again. This phrase means you are working 2 rows even. So it means you're knitting 2 more rows evenly without any increases or decreases. Again, translations in the description. At the top here, you can see the measurements and the number of stitches you should have in each section of the piece. Now, as I mentioned before, Japanese patterns do not tell you explicitly what to do every step of the way. So you have the freedom to choose here. Do you want to bind off and then seam it later? Do you want to use the Kitchener stitch? Do you want to leave the stitches on the needles and later do a 3-needle bind off? It's all up to you. So there we have it. You now have a basic understanding on Japanese knitting patterns. With a little bit of common sense, deduction, and experience, I believe anyone, no matter if you speak the language or not, can knit these beautiful Japanese designs. If you are an absolute beginner and you've never knitted a garment before, I would suggest you knit at least one garment in your native language, because Japanese knitting patterns do assume that you have a basic understanding of garment construction. For example, I already knew that we needed DPNs for the collar. I already knew how to increase and decrease on the left leaning or right leaning, depending on where I want it, and I knew how I like to join my pieces together. But that is also the great thing about Japanese knitting patterns. You can increase or decrease the level of difficulty. I hope this video gave you some confidence into exploring the world of Japanese knitting. If you found value in this video, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. It really helps me a lot. If you have any questions, let me know down below, or you can follow me over on Instagram. I check that way more often. Thanks again for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I will hopefully see you guys again next week. Bye!